For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Madiba. Author Lihle Ngcobozi joins me to discuss a book titled Mothers of the Nation, Manyano Women in South Africa. So your book looks at the Manyano women and their role in South Africa's religious and political history. So can you briefly talk to us more about the role Black Church played in politics?
I mean, the Black Church really, as I've said in the book, it really doesn't have a moment of formalization, or we can say the Black Church started with this particular date on this particular year. However, the Black Church, what it did do is that it was part of the broader based liberation struggle movements in South Africa, which really were and those type of community-based movements, such as the church as well, were quite significant in the broad-based struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So what the anti-apartheid struggle did, specifically within the Black liberation movement, is that they made use of a lot of Christian-inspired motifs around freedom, liberation, equality, equity, redemption, and God being able really to see human beings as equal. And so what the Black Church, and in collaboration with a lot of anti-apartheid struggle movements, is that they made use then of the church as a way to agitate for a more equitable, fair, and equality-based society. And most of the time we find that most of these foundational theories around liberation and the foundational ethics around liberation's theories and the ways in which the ANC in and of itself constructed a lot of their post-apartheid policies, which would then come into the post-apartheid democratic moment. All of these were around ideas of equality, equity, Christianity. And we could even see that in that transition moment as well with the TRC, where Desmond Tutu really is being seen as the key member in the post-apartheid transitionary moment. That is where we also begin to see significant motifs of redemption, Christianity, forgiveness, anti-vengeance. And all of these things signal the ways in which the Black Church was part and parcel of South Africa's liberation movement, not just only in inspiring the types of theorizations around liberation, but also the church in and of itself became the space that was infused with politics, specifically the Black Church. And then the Black Church then obviously contributes largely to the ways in which we understand liberation in South Africa today.
Mhm. And can you briefly explain to us how women changed into the iteration of the Manyoni women we find nowadays?
So much like a lot of the superstructures in South Africa or on the continent really that started out via colonialism or some sort of dominance or some sort of oppression, the church as well emerges out of a history of colonialism and Christian indoctrination through missionary contact in South Africa. However, we begin to see that sort of a lot of since a lot of women were being pulled into the Christianity space, being told to think through ideas of motherhood, Christianity, domesticity, and the ideals of what womanhood is supposed to be or look like. All of these were Christian inspired. And the moment that Black women were sort of being put into the fold of this idea of Western womanhood, which is most of the time centered on Christian ideas of what womanhood is supposed to be, Black women began to fashion then these ideas around their own understandings and interpretations of Christianity. And for then Black women, the church was no longer, or rather the women's only prayer groups or women's only sessions, which a lot of colonial missionary organizations used to do, is that particular space was used for sewing, for instilling ideas of how to keep a husband and all of those things. And then what Black women then began to do was that they began to use that space for prayer and spiritual revitalization, and praying as well for their children, because at the time we were moving away from colonialism and we were moving into formalized apartheid in South Africa. And then we began to see the destruction of the family and the destruction of the home. And then Black women began to use the church and the women's only spaces to infuse that with the material conditions that they were facing at the time: unemployment, devastations of families, being separated from their husbands due to the migrant labor system, the mines, and all of those things became part and parcel of the meetings. And as we see the Manyano women then evolve, we see them still having that type of insistence on motherhood and mothering and womanhood, being quite critical to the ways in which they understand their roles within the church, but then within society as well.
Mm-hmm. And tell us more about the role of the Manyoni with the Black counter-public sphere.
So it's quite a complicated theory that I was working with. But what I wanted to show was that when we look at different segments and sectors of society, we cannot apply the same lens to theorize different marginalized groups. So the ways in which white society or white individuals understand the ways in which apartheid played out would be significantly different to the ways in which Black people understand it through their lived experiences. And because of that, we began to see that people were experiencing South Africa from two different vantage points. One being the white dominated public sphere, which was ruled through race and racism, gender stereotypes, sexism, and all of the isms really that are most of the time anti-Black and anti-Black women. And whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we have the counter-public sphere, which really works in direct opposition to the dominant white oppressive structures of society. And in this counter-public sphere, this is where Black individuals created a space of alternative readings of politics, alternative readings of Black identity. And if we go a bit deeper, we also see women making use of this counter-public sphere to create different understandings of the ways in which motherhood works, the ways in which they understand ubufazi, the ways in which they can make use of this identity of motherhood, which is most of the time seen as conservative, but they use it in quite radical ways to enter the public sphere in ways that white society or white gendered concepts wouldn't ordinarily allow women to participate in that particular way. So in that counter-public sphere, we see Obama Manyano making use of motherhood as a political identity and not one that is oppressive. And we see that they use that in service of their communities. We see them using motherhood as a springboard for other political identities and different ways for them to enter into the political arena. And that counter-public sphere then allows for them to really make use of their identities in quite radical ways, where otherwise, if we had to lean primarily on the dominant public sphere, which is dictated by racism and sexism, they wouldn't have ordinarily been able to make use of those identities in these radical ways.
And can you explain to us the difference between motherism and feminism?
Yeah. So I think they all stand on the same strand. However, motherism really is making use of motherhood as a political identity. Because we know the dictates of patriarchy say that if you are a woman, you're confined to the home, you do not really participate in the economic or the political activities of the day. You're really confined to the home and the domestication of that identity. And what motherism then does is that it takes that particular identity of being a mother, and not necessarily a biological mother, but having the authority of mama in a particular setting. They make use of that identity to agitate for other political, so they make use of their motherhood to agitate for other political causes through their identity as mothers, through understanding that motherhood offers them a particular authority in South Africa, in society, and the seniority that comes with being umama, umdala, affords you a particular kind of authority that you wouldn't ordinarily get as a young woman such as myself or as you. And so what motherism then does is that it makes use of this identity to insert particular kind of politics into the public sphere, and to say that through motherhood we can speak about the economy, through motherhood we can speak about politics, we can speak about climate change, we can speak about gender-based violence because of the authority that women have in society. And feminism, I think it also I think they exist on the similar scale. However, what feminism does is that it really wants to break away from these subjectivities such as motherhood, sister, wife, and really give women their own identity and to give women their own sense of political agency without being tied down to a particular identity. So through feminism, then you make particular inferences around politics, around gender, around the superstructure of race and racism and class in ways that you just make use of your identity as a human being. Whereas motherism really takes seriously the idea that motherhood is quite central to the ways in which people organize politically.
Mm-hmm. And you touched a bit on motherhood. So, can you tell us how motherhood propelled Black women to protect their children from apartheid violence?
Mm. So I think part of the apartheid state in South Africa, what it did is that it really imposed, or rather, it made use of the state as a way to to dictate the ways in which the home is supposed to work. So what the state did is that it dictated who is supposed to work where and when. Because of spatial geography and the economic setup in South Africa, we found that men were being taken away from their homes and women were then becoming the head of the household. And then what then happens is that when, in the absence of men and in the absence of this seemingly authoritative figure that is the man, women then step up into that position. And by virtue of stepping up into that position, they really shift the terrain of what gender roles and gender dynamics are supposed to look like and how they're supposed to operate. So when you're looking at um, the apartheid structure in relation to how it created significant dysfunction in the Black family, you see then Black women being expected to fill in that gap and to fill in that role. And in filling in that role, then they begin to make use of motherhood as a way to penetrate politics, because the very essence of their being, according to them, which is motherhood, is being threatened by the state. And also the state is threatening the livelihood of their children because of the ways in which the migrant labor system was created in South Africa. So then what they do is that they see that the threat to the very being of motherhood, the inability to provide due to the past laws at the time, those were really infringing on their ability to be good mothers, to provide for their children, to gain employment, to have an income. So that is why then we saw that big march that we now commemorate as Women's Day. That big march really was a signal for women to say, in the absence of this patriarchal authority that society says that men are supposed to be in the home, in the absence of that, what then do we do if the state is infringing on our very right to protect our children because of these anti-pass laws, and also because of the Group Areas Act that didn't allow women to be at a particular area without a particular documentation. So all of these showed that the apartheid state was not only geared around the destruction of Black society, but it had a hold in the destruction of the household. And because women at the time were predominant members of that household, that is why women then began to make use of their identities as mothers, to make sure that they make particular claims against the apartheid state.
Mm-hmm. And please share with us your childhood and young adult memories spent in church.
So my grandmother is Umama Manyano, and I've always just been around them for as long as I could remember. And, we all know on Easter, Ipasika, you go at like 8 o'clock in the morning, you listen to the Amazwe Skhenke for the whole day. And through that culture of being part of, being with a parent who was so involved in the Mama Woman, I began to, understand the things that they did and to follow what they did, be part of the different celebrations and the different events that they would have. And all of these, I think, were signaling that this book would probably come out in the next 10 years after that. And so I have very, very fond memories of Mama Manyano, specifically because I would, as a kid, I'd used to watch my grand get dressed in the morning in a uniform and she'd pray over it. And I didn't know what all of that meant, but now having researched this, I have a greater understanding and a greater appreciation for them.
Mhm. And chapter 5 of your book touches on rituals and death. So, can you please explain to us why do you say the late Winnie Madikizela Mandela's use of the social category of mother was broadly conceived in social and political terms rather than in terms of women's role within the nuclear family?
Yeah, I think Mam Winnie is a very interesting character because she was able to she was able to penetrate the public sphere specifically at that time in ways that a lot of women were not able to do. So if we look at the likes of Umam Albertina Sisulu, if we look at the likes of um, Thabo Mbeki's mom, Apinet Mbeki, and you look at that generation of women, they really weren't able to penetrate that public sphere at the level at which Umamwini Madikizela had done. And part of what was interesting for me was that Umama really made use of motherhood as an important role for her in safeguarding and protecting the Black community. So she wasn't identifying as mother of the nation insofar as she was saying, I'm a mother that stays at home and looks after my kids. But what she's doing is that she's making, like I've said, making use of that sense of authority that Black women have as mothers in the community and making use of that to make particular political to communicate political messages and to communicate against the anarchy and the brutality of the apartheid government, specifically that was meted out against young Black children in the township in which her activism was quite prominent. And so making use of motherhood for her wasn't at least my reading of it, wasn't really about identifying as Nelson Mandela's wife and the mother of Zinzi and Zenani and her kids, but she was making use of this iconography of motherhood being crushed by the state, specifically when it comes to Black women, and how she refused to let the state crush that particular identity. And she made that prominence of motherhood and mothering as part and parcel of a political identity and the social category that she used then to enter into other public spheres and other debates around the economy, around the arms struggle, around the politics. And the way she used motherhood for me was incredibly fascinating because it shows us that despite what white feminist thinking might say about motherhood being a conservative, oppressive, um, um, non-political identity, we see Black women making use of motherhood in very interesting ways, in radical ways, in insightful ways, and in ways that make can have the possibility of bringing the state to its knees, because we know that Umamuni Madikizela Mandela was the number one target of the state. And because of her iconography of motherhood, she was able to galvanize so much support from the general public in South Africa because they understood her prominence as Umama Wesizwe, protecting the Black community. So for her, I think it was quite interesting in the way that she was able to escape the confines of motherhood as we understand it and make use of it in quite interesting ways.
And lastly, what are you hoping people take away from reading your book?
I think, if anything, I would like them to have a broader understanding of what Umama Manyano are, but also having a broader sense of their impact on South Africa's political history. Because I don't think we actually understand or we take time to read about the history of who they are and their contribution to the post-apartheid democratic state that we live in now. You know, we only see them as Omama Bebaki that go to church on a Sunday. We see them on Thursday when they go to their meetings, but we don't appreciate the lineage and the history which they come out of, and the politicization of that group in and of itself. I don't think we pay much attention to that. And I'm hoping that people can begin to see them just a bit more deeply and read and give them a bit more of a theoretical reading, specifically around issues of motherism, how they contribute to post-apartheid feminisms, how they contribute to understandings of womanhood and ubufazi, and how they give us a different language to explain the realities of Black women in South Africa and why they still identify with this particular grouping or this particular organization.
That was Lihle Ngcobozi speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about Mothers of the Nation, Manyano women in South Africa.